Hi and welcome to Bible Breeze, the channel for a breath of fresh air on the pages of your Bible. We are looking at the Hebrew Scriptures and the Bible, and in the last video we checked out different literary types like narrative, poetry and prose discourse. And in this video we want to have a look at one very specific type of literature that the Bible is. It's Jewish meditation literature, and that is something quite unique and something also quite unfamiliar to most of us. So let's start with the video from Bible Project and then talk a little more about it afterwards.
So the Bible is a collection of books written in different literary styles like narrative, poetry, and prose. And most of us are familiar with these kinds of literature.
Yeah, we all know a narrative when we see one, like The Hunger Games or The Great Gatsby.
And most people can recognize poetry, whether it's Walt Whitman or the songs of Bob Dylan.
And every day we're surrounded by prose and news articles or essays.
Now all of these examples are modern American literature in that they came from this time period and this region of the world.
But there's also medieval English literature from another place in time, or ancient Greek writings from this place in time.
So each time period and culture produces its own unique kind of literature.
And in order to read the Bible well, we need to keep in mind that it comes from this part of the world and was produced in this basic period of time.
So what's unique about ancient Jewish literature?
Well, a key feature is that it lacks a lot of the details that modern readers have come to expect in stories and poems.
And this makes it seem really simple.
But actually, it's very sophisticated literature. Every detail that is given matters.
And that's great, but the lack of detail means that stories are often loaded with ambiguities. I mean, take one of the first stories, Adam and Eve in the garden. Where did this talking snake come from? And why did God allow him there? Why didn't Adam and Eve die on the spot like God said they would? And who's this offspring of the woman who will destroy the snake but is bitten by it?
Yeah, so many puzzles in this story. And some of these are questions that we have and that are not important to what the author is focusing on. But some of these ambiguities are intentional.
Intentional? Won't that lead to bad interpretations, people filling in the gaps with their own answers?
Well, that's a risk the biblical authors took in writing this way. We all tend to impose our own cultural assumptions onto the Bible, but they apparently thought the risk was worth it. These oddities are really invitations into an adventure of reading and discovery.
What do you mean?
Well, for example, the strange promise about the offspring of the woman crushing and being bitten by the snake. That word offspring is a clue to pay attention to genealogies, which, lo and behold, run all through the biblical narrative. They trace the lineage from Eve all the way to King David and his offspring. And in the New Testament, Jesus is connected to the offspring of this royal line. Now, when you read the prophets, Isaiah connected this king to the suffering servant who would die on behalf of his people. And then, in the book of Revelation, there's this symbolic vision. And can you guess? It's about a woman and her offspring. It's Jesus and his followers who conquer the dragon by giving up their lives.
Yeah, so each part of the story there is loaded with ambiguities, but altogether, it makes sense.
And this is the literary genius of the Bible. It forces you to keep reading and then interpret each part in light of the others.
This is feeling complicated. I don't know if I can do all that.
Well, you're actually not expected to notice all of this by yourself or all at once. This dense way of writing forces you to slow down and then read carefully, embarking on this interactive discovery process through the whole biblical narrative over a lifetime of reading and rereading.
Ah, okay. Meditation literature.
Yeah, in Psalm 1, we read about the ideal Bible reader. It's someone who meditates on the scriptures day and night. In Hebrew, the word meditate means literally to mutter or speak quietly. The idea is that every day for the rest of your life, you slowly, quietly read the Bible out loud to yourself, and then go talk about it with your friends, pondering the puzzles, making connections, and discovering what it all means. And as you let the Bible interpret itself, something remarkable happens. The Bible starts to read you. Because ultimately, the writers of the Bible want you to adopt this story as your story.
So this ancient Jewish writing style, it must create unique types of narrative and poetry and discourse.
Yes, and we'll explore all of those literary styles starting next with biblical narrative.
Okay, again, a great video from the Bible Project, introducing something that has been new to me and might be new to you as well. So the Bible doesn't always give us all the details that we'd like to read about, and I guess you've noticed that. We don't know, did Adam and Eve have a belly button? How did the snake end up in the garden? And lots of things that we would like to know and that we as modern readers are used to be given when we read a normal novel. And now we have the Bible in front of us. And I don't know, when I was young, I've been told, well, the Bible is very simple and any child can read the Bible and get it. And I want to be honest with you, I don't think that is true. And I think it's very, very misleading. It was easier for me to read the Bible when I was young because I did just that. I just filled in the gaps with what I thought should belong there. Again, I had already a preconceived idea what the story of the Bible was about, and my mind did quite well in adjusting it all and make it fit. And so I could read the Gospel of John and just say, hey, it's so easy, we should hand it out to anybody on the street. And I would be a bit more hesitant to do that nowadays, and I have way more questions. Because what I've realized, and what probably you realized, otherwise you wouldn't watch, is that stories are actually not that easy and simple, and that the Bible is quite a complex piece of literature. I'd like to compare the Bible sometimes a little bit to a symphony that has been written by Bach or somebody like that. And in that sense, it's true that any child can enjoy it. And I wouldn't say children shouldn't read the Bible, but I would say they might not understand everything and they might not grasp the depth of everything, like I still don't do it in my older age already. So you can enjoy a great symphony, but when you learn a little bit about music, you enjoy it even more. When you learn more about composition, techniques, music theory, all of this, you enjoy it even more. When you start learning about the biographies of the authors, of the composers, you get into more and more and more depth, and you discover the genius of what is going on. And the whole symphony becomes more and more meaningful to you because you can relate it to more and more things. And that is the same with the stories of the Bible. The more you can see connection points, the more you can relate them to other stories, and of course to your own life and to your own story, the more meaningful they become. So in the Bible we read a lot of stories, and like I said, they are not easy, they're not simple. They only tell us what happened, but usually they don't tell us what to think of it. Like, was that good? Is that bad? What should I think about it? There's a story of the prophet Elisha, and there are some boys and they mock him and they say, you're a bold head, and then he gets very angry and he kind of curses them, and then there are some bears coming from the forest and killing all these young men, and you wonder, okay, was that okay? Was that not okay? Should we do that at home? Was God okay with that? When I was young, I just thought, well, Elisha is one of the good guys, so everything he does is good and is God ordained, and that settles it. But then, of course, there are more and more stories where you wonder, yeah, I'm not sure if that's good or not. So how do we find that out? Sometimes the story tells us that something is bad, but sometimes not. We have stories like Judah and Tamar, and we wonder, what is that? No comment. There are people who have more than one wife. No comment. Just because something is in the Bible does not mean that it is necessarily a good thing. It's not always clear what it is. Sometimes what we have later on is we have some more objective teaching passages. We get the law, we get the prophets, where people say more explicitly, this is bad, or this is what God wants, and this is what he doesn't want. And that could help us interpret it. But that is not always the case. Actually, most of the times is not. So what do we do with these stories? So let's acknowledge, first of all, they are not simple. Secondly, stories are not encyclopedias or principal books. Sometimes we have a tendency to use stories for information, like an encyclopedia or a compendium. We just have to rearrange the material to know what the Bible says about X, Y, Z. And we use a story to kind of squeeze out a principle or a truth. And when we do that, we actually reduce the text. We lose something, and sometimes we may even end up destroying the text. It's almost like dissecting an animal. Slowly, part by part, we take apart all the different organs, we take them away, and then at the end, what do you have left? Nothing but not an animal, you know, it's a corpse, it's something lifeless. And I think this is really, really important, and that we don't just get a Sunday sermon and then we say, well, all you need to know, all you need to learn from this story is this. You know, if God wanted to give us very, very short principles, he could have done it. And he did it. I mean, there's a whole book called Proverbs, which is basically just small principles. So if we have a story and not a 2-sentence principle, there must be something more behind it than just getting a yes or a no. It's the same with any art form. When you take dance or music or fine art, filmmaking, writing, there is a unity between a message and a medium that cannot be taken apart. If it could, it was probably bad art. We call that propaganda. You know, you paint a rainbow and some crosses and put a Bible verse on it. And that is not high integrity in the art form. I've heard the story of a dancer, and she danced something, a beautiful dance, and at the end one of the people observing her said, well, could you please tell us what your dance means? Could you explain in words what you've danced and what we should take away from this? And then the lady said, well, listen, if I could have expressed it in words, I would not have danced, right? And sometimes that is challenging for us, because we have one way that we want to get our information and our truth and our principles and our squeeze. And I think on the inside, we all intuitively notice life is more complex, and our lives are more complex than just do this and then this will come out. And I think we all notice this. In this way, stories reflect in a wonderful way the ambiguity and the complexity of the lives that we have. So sometimes it's easier to kind of enter the story, to live in the stories, identify with the people that are involved and discover parallels. That's something that already Paul wrote. He talked about the generation that wandered in the wilderness after the Exodus, and he says to his audience, like 1,000 years later, now these things happened as examples for us, so that we might not desire evil things as they did. These things happened to them to serve as an example, and they were written down to instruct us. So we can learn something from the story of another person, of a people group. And reminder, not every story is about what you individually should learn. Sometimes stories are about what we as a community should learn from something. So often what we can learn is that how did God act with people? God is still the same, and he can act similarly in our lives. Abraham leaves his country, his father house, and trusts God for his future, and so can I, and so can you. God promises to Abraham that he will have many descendants looking at the stars. You might not have the same promise from God, but you have the same faithful God. Abraham's servant asked God to guide him in finding a wife for Isaac. That might not be your need or the culture. I wouldn't do this for a friend, but God guides him to the right place. Jacob cheats his way through life and is being cheated by Laban, by his sons, sometimes in the very same way. You know, he cheats about who is firstborn and who is secondborn, and that's the way he is cheated afterwards by his uncle, and he gets the firstborn instead of the secondborn. And God tries to gradually transform him and work with him, and we can learn something there. After Jacob fights at the Jabbok, he settles in Shechem. He buys land, which means he wants to settle there. But he had actually promised God in Bethel to return to Bethel, and God allows trouble to come, and finally Jacob gives up his gods and moves to Bethel, and only then does God appear to him again. So God works with people that are not perfect, that are sometimes completely stubborn, that are not cooperative at all. And so sometimes that could give us hope, maybe for our own lives, or maybe for a stubborn person that is around us, where we wonder, will God's will ever come true or through in our own life because others don't seem to cooperate. So lots and lots of things that we can meditate and ponder upon. So when we have the story of Judah and Tamar, for example, What can we learn from this? There are different levels of narrative. There are very individual stories about single people. So you have Judah and Tamar, and you wonder why has the Joseph story started already, and then we get Judah and Tamar, and then the Joseph story continues? I mean, would anybody miss it if the story wasn't there? So we look for the context, and we might realize a number of things, that the faithfulness of Joseph is even more highlighted, his integrity in relationships, when we look at Judah and Tamar and how that played out. Actually, Tamar is quite okay, but Judah doesn't get away so nicely. There are stories about, can you identify this? That happens with Jacob before, and then with Judah and Tamar. And so we might figure out what are lessons that we should learn, and how to deal with people, how to cheat or how to not cheat. All of this, very, very individual level. But then we have stories about that work more on a historic level, or on the history of Israel. So the Judah and Tamar story is also a story about a whole tribe. Judah would have had no more descendants. He had like 3 sons, and the first 2 died, and the third one he didn't want to give in marriage. So this whole tribe would have been extinct. And the story is not just about an individual like Tamar and how she is saved, but about the whole tribe of Judah. Why does it still exist? How did it happen? And then, interestingly, through a Canaanite. And the Canaanites don't come away so nicely later in the story. So that is very interesting. And then we have, of course, also the very big meta-narrative, the story of the whole world. So God's overarching purpose. And stories usually also play a role there. So, for example, Tamar appears in Matthew 1 in the genealogy of Jesus. And she's one of the 4 women that are mentioned as ancestors of Jesus. So there is even a universal redemptive purpose in why we have that story there. And so there are many, many different layers that we could scan through and say, well, could this relevant for this? Could this be relevant for this, or for that, or for something else? And often stories don't just have or make one point. Quite often there is more than one, and we don't necessarily need to fight and argue about these things. On a big meta-narrative, for example, you can see in the very first and the very last pages of the Bible how they connect with each other. If you compare the first and the last 3 chapters, they talk about heaven and earth, a new heaven and a new earth. Or it starts with darkness, ends with no more night. We talk about sun and moon. At the end, there will not be more sun and moon. Death will be no more. In the beginning, there's a serpent and a deceiver. At the end, evil is destroyed. There will be nothing unclean anymore. And so on. You can see it in the end. People see God's face. The tree of life even reappears at the end. So it seems, even when we read Revelation, we should always consider, where have these images, where have we seen them before, where has this story started? Is there an arc that is kind of brought to an end with this story? And this takes a lifetime. This really takes long, and I so strongly recommend doing that together. We do that in our YWAM Discipleship Bible Schools, where we read the Bible together in groups in the afternoons. I highly recommend it. Maybe you are in a DBS right now and watch these videos as part of it. So that is a really, really cool place to be, because you see, you hear, you connect way more things together than you do alone. And do not expect that this will all happen in one reading through the Bible, or in 2 or 3 or 5. But it will become more and more and more. And what increases is the depth and the meaning of passages. Like the example I gave with looking at an event that happened when I was 12. How significant it is that increases and grows with the growing years, because you realize what else is connected to the thing that happened back then. And this is the same for the Bible. Okay, so much for now. And in the coming videos, we will dive more specific and more deeply into narrative, and we will look at plot and characters and settings, and then we get it all together in design patterns. And that is absolutely amazing and will help you a great deal to make sense of a lot of the confusing things that you sometimes read in the Bible. So see you back then. Bye-bye.